For months, astronomers have been watching Mars with quiet disbelief. Something strange is happening to the red planet, something that wasn't in any prediction model. Its upper atmosphere, once steady and thin, has begun to shimmer unnaturally, pulsing faintly every few hours as though it's breathing. The cause wasn't solar radiation. It wasn't cosmic dust. It was something else. Something that shouldn't even be there. When NASA's MAVEN orbiter transmitted its latest spectrographic data, scientists noticed a pattern. Fluctuations in the ionosphere matching a signal first detected weeks earlier, not from Mars itself, but from deep space. A pattern identical to the one emanating from the interstellar visitor known as Through-Eye Atlas. At first, no one wanted to say it out loud. Through-Eye Atlas had already defied expectations once before, behaving like no known comet, emitting no visible tail, and maintaining an impossible trajectory through the solar plane. But now, with Mars showing synchronized atmospheric oscillations, silence wasn't an option. This wasn't coincidence. Something had linked the two worlds. If you're fascinated by these cosmic alignments, by the strange, elegant ways the universe reveals its hidden connections, make sure to subscribe. Because what's unfolding right now between Through-Eye Atlas and Mars could redefine not just planetary science, but our understanding of life itself. The data coming in from Mars was clearer than anyone expected. High-resolution imaging from the ExoMars Trace Gas Orbiter revealed a faint auroral glow across the night side of the planet, a light too consistent to be mere atmospheric reaction. It wasn't caused by the sun, nor by Martian magnetism. It was coming from the ground. Spectral analysis pointed to regions inside Jezero crater, the same site where the Perseverance rover had detected ancient organic compounds months earlier. The aurora's frequency perfectly matched the EM emissions from Through-Eye Atlas's trajectory as it moved past the sun. The realization sent a chill through the global astronomy community. The interstellar object wasn't just influencing Mars, it was interacting with it. Dr. Annika Serrano of the European Space Observatory described it best. It's as if Mars is responding. Like something dormant beneath the surface heard a signal and answered. For the first time in history, the data didn't just show environmental change, it showed behavioral response. Temperatures beneath Jezero's surface spiked by 2 degrees, followed by bursts of methane unlike any recorded before. Mars wasn't just reacting to sunlight, it was reacting to something else. The implications were staggering. Theories began to pour in faster than observatories could verify them. One group from Kyoto University proposed that the object's gravitational field wasn't merely static, it was modulating, creating subtle waveforms that resonated with Mars's magnetic poles. Another from MIT went further, suggesting that Through-Eye Atlas might be composed of exotic matter capable of transmitting quantum interference patterns, effectively pinging other celestial bodies like nodes in a cosmic network. The public wanted answers. NASA held an emergency press briefing. For a moment, the world stopped to listen. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, one of the leading exobiologists on the Perseverance mission, stepped forward and said the words that would ignite every forum, every podcast, every midnight debate. We are observing non-random responses on Mars, patterned reactions. We cannot yet explain them. The silence that followed was heavier than any answer could have been. From there, things escalated. Amateur astronomers began uploading footage of Mars's faint oscillations, captured through backyard telescopes. In infrared, the planet seemed to flicker, just slightly, as though wrapped in invisible waves. The effect repeated every 19 hours, the same period during which Through-Eye Atlas made its nearest approach to the solar equator. Coincidence? Hardly. Even the James Webb Space Telescope, tuned to deep infrared frequencies, picked up fluctuations in Mars's heat signature. Narrow, rhythmic, deliberate. It was like a conversation written in light. And then, just days later, something even more alarming appeared. MAVEN's magnetometers registered a pulse, a magnetic echo travelling outward from Mars toward the Sun. It wasn't natural, it wasn't solar wind. It was perfectly geometric and perfectly timed. When visualised in 3D, it resembled a spiral, a logarithmic curve identical to the path Through-Eye Atlas had taken through interplanetary space. The same curve seen in nature, DNA, and galactic arms. Nature's oldest signature, the golden ratio, repeating itself now in magnetic form, from Mars to the object that had no business responding. Dr. Serrano's team gave it a name, the resonance. At that point, the story broke containment. Headlines called it everything from the Martian signal to the awakening of Jezero. But in private, behind encrypted research servers and sleepless scientists, the conversation had shifted from curiosity to fear. Because if 3I Atlas could alter magnetic fields across millions of kilometers, it could alter much more than that. Mars was no longer just a planet under observation. It had become part of an active system, one whose origin and purpose remained terrifyingly unknown. The first time the resonance repeated, it was subtle, a faint ripple in the magnetosphere nearly drowned by solar wind. But 3 days later it returned, stronger, clearer, structured. This time, scientists noticed something impossible. The signal carried phase shifts identical to Martian seismic activity. In other words, whatever was happening in Mars's atmosphere was syncing perfectly with what was happening under its surface. The team at NASA's Jet Propulsion laboratory cross-referenced seismic data from the InSight lander, which, though retired, had continued passively collecting data. To their astonishment, the timestamps aligned. Buried beneath Jezero crater, where sedimentary layers once held traces of ancient water, a rhythmic vibration pulsed in harmony with 3I Atlas's changing velocity around the Sun. That meant only one thing. The interstellar object wasn't just influencing Mars remotely, it was being answered. At the European Space Astronomy Centre, linguist Dr. Mateo Ruiz joined the team, not because they thought it was language, but because it was too patterned not to be. The intervals between pulses followed mathematical ratios common in both biology and physics: Fibonacci progressions, harmonic octaves, and prime intervals. It's communication, Ruiz said quietly, but not as we know it. It's like watching two instruments tune each other. By the fourth recorded cycle, Mars's thin atmosphere began producing a peculiar radio echo, something that resembled the electromagnetic equivalent of sonar. Signals bounced off its upper layers, scattering toward deep space. And where did they go? Straight toward 3I Atlas. At this point, the debate fractured the scientific community. One faction insisted it was a natural electromagnetic feedback loop, a rare interplay between solar radiation and the planet's magnetosphere. The other side, led by Dr. Hayes and Dr. Serrano, refused to dismiss the timing. Because at the very moment Mars's radio echo peaked, 3I Atlas changed course. It wasn't a deviation by gravity or solar wind, it was a micro-adjustment, deliberate, directional, subtle enough to go unnoticed by casual observation, but obvious to anyone comparing orbital data. For the first time, an interstellar object had reacted to something. That was the breaking point. The media flooded with speculation. Words like alien, signal, and probe resurfaced. But scientists remained careful. They avoided assumptions and fear. They focused on data. Because what came next was far stranger than any theory about visitors or technology. As the resonance continued, the auroral glow across Jezero intensified, shifting from faint blue to a brilliant green, then fading to infrared invisible to the human eye. Maven's spectrometers caught the moment perfectly, traces of ionized silicates rising from the crater's floor, as though something within the regolith had reactivated. For decades, planetary scientists believed Jezero held remnants of a delta, where life might once have thrived. But what if, instead of life, it had preserved memory? Dr. Hayes proposed a hypothesis as radical as it was elegant, that ancient mineral compounds beneath Mars's surface were capable of storing electromagnetic patterns, natural recordings left by solar storms, meteor impacts, or even primitive biochemical processes. And if 3I Atlas emitted resonance fields strong enough, it might be playing back that record. In other words, 3I Atlas might have turned Mars itself into an instrument. Every fluctuation, every hum, every light pulse could be the planet's own history, resonating, replaying, rewriting itself under cosmic influence. Then came the true shock. Using the ExoMars orbiter's radar, scientists discovered a perfectly geometric formation beneath the crater floor. Roughly 1.7 kilometers wide, it appeared hexagonal, too symmetrical to be random geology. Its reflective density matched that of basalt, but its internal layering pattern repeated in ratios that mirrored the resonance's frequency. The structure wasn't artificial, not in the way of machines, but it was precise. Nature didn't form things like this often, especially not aligned so perfectly toward the sun's position relative to 3I Atlas's perihelion path. Rui stared at the radar image for nearly an hour before speaking. "It's not a base," he said finally. "It's a tuning fork." From that moment, the nature of the event changed completely. Every 19-hour cycle, 3 Atlas sent a resonance wave. Mars absorbed it, amplified it, and released a lower harmonic back into space, toward the object. The two were now locked in what Dr. Serrano called a gravitational duet. But here's where it got worse. Each time Mars sent its harmonic return, the strength of the resonance across the solar system increased slightly. The sun's outer corona began to exhibit microfluctuations. Jupiter's magnetosphere, usually stable, showed faint distortions at matching intervals. Whatever Mars and 3I Atlas were doing, they weren't doing it alone anymore. It had started to spread. In closed-door meetings, space agencies quietly shared their fears. If resonance can move through electromagnetic fields, if it can use the solar wind itself as a conductor, then every planet, every moon, every body connected to the sun's magnetic web could soon vibrate with the same pattern. No one dared say it aloud, but the question lingered. What happens when the entire solar system begins to resonate? For now, scientists can only listen, trying to decode the pulse of Mars and the quiet hum of a visitor from the stars. But the strangest part, amid all the fear and speculation, the data revealed something chillingly consistent. The harmonic ratio of the resonance, the same one echoing from Mars and 3I Atlas, matches the frequency of the human heartbeat. For weeks, the resonance between Mars and 3I Atlas continued like a silent metronome ticking through space. Every 19 hours the cycle repeated, a perfect, unwavering pulse that no natural system should maintain so precisely. But then something shifted. The pulse doubled. On the solar observatories across Earth's night side, researchers noticed faint ripples crawling across the sun's outer layers, oscillations that didn't belong. They weren't sunspots, they weren't flares, they were patterns, rhythmic, symmetrical, almost intelligent. The Solar Dynamics Observatory captured the first clear images, subtle but measurable waves expanding across the corona, forming faint hexagonal rings. Their spacing, identical to the frequency of the Mars 3I Atlas resonance. In silence, the astrophysics community realized the impossible. The Sun, the most stable object in our sky, was now pulsing to the same beat as a comet that shouldn't exist. At NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, Mission Director Dr. Hayes called it a feedback loop on a cosmic scale. 3 Atlas emitted the signal, Mars responded, and now the Sun was listening. The team couldn't explain how, but the data was clear. Solar wind velocities began fluctuating every 19 hours, aligning perfectly with the resonance. The entire heliosphere, the magnetic bubble that shields every planet in the solar system, was beginning to hum. Meanwhile, spacecraft far from Earth started picking it up too. Voyager 2, still transmitting faintly from the edge of interstellar space, recorded micro-variations in background plasma waves. Pioneer 10, long silent, emitted a brief, inexplicable carrier tone. It lasted less than 2 seconds, but it matched the frequency exactly. No one could deny it anymore. This wasn't noise, it was a network. Dr. Serrano summarized it in a single haunting statement. Something has linked our entire solar system, and Mars was just the first note. At first, agencies tried to keep it quiet. They told the public it was a harmless solar fluctuation. But independent observatories, amateur astronomers with spectral monitors and private satellites, started posting their own results. The resonance wasn't random. It grew louder every day, and now it was measurable even in Earth's magnetic field. In Alaska, auroras began shimmering at unusual latitudes, pulsing with a strange consistency every 19 hours. Pilots reported compass anomalies. Satellite operators noted brief signal drops at regular intervals. Somewhere between the Sun and Mars, an invisible wave was expanding. But the real breakthrough came not from NASA or ESA, but from an old radio telescope array in Argentina. A graduate researcher named Luis Rojas noticed that if you sped up the resonance data by a factor of 432, it formed a clear waveform, not random, not chaotic, structured. And when plotted visually, It resembled the same spiral geometry seen in the orbital path of 3I Atlas. That ratio, 432, wasn't arbitrary. It's found in natural harmonics, planetary rotations, even the frequency used in ancient tuning systems. It was as if the entire system had begun to align itself musically. Rojas's discovery spread like wildfire through the astrophysics community. What if this wasn't interference? What if it was intentional calibration? Dr. Ruiz proposed a daring interpretation. If the Sun is resonating and Mars is responding, we may not be observing communication between objects, but a process of synchronization. The solar system could be harmonizing to a universal frequency. The implications were staggering. Every planet, every moon, every magnetic body might be slowly aligning its internal oscillations to match that of 3I Atlas. If true, then the visitor wasn't just influencing the solar system, it was tuning it. At the same time, the object itself began to change. High-resolution imagery from the James Webb Space Telescope showed faint iridescent waves pulsing across its surface, ripples of refracted light that didn't match reflection or material composition. Spectral analysis revealed traces of metallic hydrogen, the same exotic element theorized to exist deep within Jupiter's core. Meaning whatever 3I Atlas was made of, it wasn't a simple frozen rock. It was a conductor, a resonant instrument. Theorists revisited an old question that had haunted astronomers since the discovery of Oumuamua. What if these interstellar visitors aren't random? What if they're part of something larger? Fragments of a cosmic architecture built on resonance, carrying instructions from one star system to another. The more they analysed, the clearer it became that 3 Atlas's presence wasn't transient. Its orbital decay was zero. Its trajectory stabilised into a near-circular path around the Sun, a perfect resonance orbit. No comet has ever done that. And as it settled, the solar oscillation stabilised too. Every flare, every ripple, every anomaly across Mars and the surrounding space synchronized like an orchestra finding its tempo. It was as though the entire solar system took a deep breath and began to hum in unison. But harmony doesn't always mean peace. Over the next few weeks, the solar output increased by a fraction of a percent, a small change, yet enough to alter the balance of everything orbiting it. Earth's upper atmosphere expanded slightly. Venus brightened. And for the first time since the resonance began, a new tone appeared in the background noise of the Sun, lower, slower, and unmistakably artificial. It wasn't coming from 3I Atlas, it was coming from within the Sun itself. Scientists stared in silence as the spectrogram revealed something that froze them. The tone contained modulation patterns identical to the signal Mars had first emitted weeks earlier, meaning the Sun wasn't just resonating anymore, it was answering. At first, no one wanted to believe it. The Sun, a seething sphere of plasma and nuclear fury, couldn't possibly be transmitting anything coherent. Its every movement was chaos made visible. Yet there it was, in the data. Structured harmonic modulation, repeating in cycles that lined up perfectly with 3I Atlas and Mars. The team at NASA's Heliospheric Observatory confirmed the impossible. The Sun's low-frequency emissions were now organized. Not random noise, not turbulence, patterned, layered, intentional. Each pulse carried subharmonic frequencies that formed geometric ratios, fractal, recursive, self-similar across scales. In simpler terms, the same mathematical logic found in living systems. The moment the data went public, it fractured the world. Headlines screamed, "The Sun is singing." Some called it a natural phenomenon, a solar symphony born of cosmic coincidence. Others whispered darker ideas, that the Sun was no longer behaving as a star but as something aware. Behind the noise, scientists stayed focused. They stripped the data, filtered the harmonics, and noticed something chilling. The frequencies weren't just mathematical, they were biocompatible. At 783 Hz, the Schumann resonance, Earth's natural electromagnetic rhythm, the signal spiked sharply. And it wasn't isolated. Across multiple observatories, magnetometers around the globe picked up faint rhythmic oscillations synchronized with the solar modulation. Human EEG tests began showing the same thing, a subtle alignment in brainwave activity corresponding to those same harmonic peaks. The resonance wasn't just affecting planets, it was bleeding into consciousness. Dr. Hayes' private note, later leaked from JPL, summarized it simply. If this is transmission, it's not just being received by machines, it's being felt. Meanwhile, 3i Atlas itself had changed again. The once dark interstellar traveller now glowed faintly in the infrared spectrum, as if absorbing and re-emitting the sun's new harmonics. Its tail, if it could still be called that, extended not in a straight line, but in a spiral. A perfect mirror of the sun's new resonance pattern. By the third solar cycle, a cascade effect began. Earth's magnetic field, usually stable, started to oscillate ever so slightly. Not dangerously, but noticeably. Compass readings drifted by fractions of a degree every 19 hours. Northern lights began appearing at latitudes where no auroras had ever been seen. And then came the first real anomaly. On October 17th, a brief, localized blackout hit satellite communications over the Pacific. For 23 minutes, every frequency band went silent, except one. A narrowband carrier signal appeared, identical to the harmonic structure of the solar resonance, but slower, like a recording played at half speed. When decoded, it didn't contain words or symbols, just ratios, golden spirals, prime intervals, harmonic loops. It wasn't language, but architecture. A kind of cosmic engineering blueprint written in resonance. Dr. Ruiz, studying the decoded signal, whispered during a live feed, "It's not communication, it's replication." Every few hours, that same carrier tone returned. Faint, global, perfectly synchronized. It wasn't broadcasting to us. It was calibrating through us. Sensors at CERN and the European Space Agency's magnetometers began picking up corresponding shifts deep beneath Earth's crust, electromagnetic oscillations that matched the sun's modulation. Our planet's molten core, the very dynamo that generates its magnetic shield, was responding to the pulse. Meanwhile, 3i Atlas maintained its impossible orbit, a stable loop inside the sun's resonance zone. No decay, no deviation, no explanation. It had become a permanent part of the solar system. As the data spread, so did the fear. Was this a form of natural synchronization, or was it something more deliberate? Theorists began calling it the integration hypothesis. According to Dr. Serrano's team, the resonance was evolving, not biologically but physically, turning each magnetic field, each planetary core into a node of a vast distributed network. Mars had been the first to awaken, now the Sun had joined, and Earth was next. On October 22nd, a strange atmospheric event unfolded across multiple continents. At precisely 0317 UTC, auroras burst into existence across both hemispheres, even in regions near the equator. For 12 minutes, the skies glowed red, blue, and violet. Then, just as suddenly, the light collapsed into a single golden hue before vanishing completely. Satellites recorded faint electromagnetic echoes afterward, but not from space, from Earth's oceans. Deep hydroacoustic sensors off the Pacific Rim began detecting low-frequency vibrations, not earthquakes, but rhythmic tones. When analysed, those tones matched the solar resonance. It was as though the oceans themselves had begun to sing. By now, the pattern was undeniable. 3i Atlas had initiated resonance, Mars had responded, the Sun had amplified, and Earth had joined the symphony. But one question still haunted scientists. To what end? Every known model said this should have dissipated by now, but instead it was stabilizing, as though the system had reached equilibrium. Then came the final discovery, one so subtle it almost went unnoticed. When NASA plotted the trajectories of Mars, 3i Atlas, and Earth in relation to the Sun over the past 6 weeks, the orbits formed a perfect three-point pattern, an equilateral triangle, rotating in sync with the resonance. This wasn't random alignment, it was design, geometry on a cosmic scale. Ruiz stared at the data for hours before writing a single line in his report. They're building something, and we're part of it. The meaning of they was never defined. Not life, not intelligence, just something older than language, using gravity and light the way we use ink and sound. And yet, through the fear and uncertainty, a strange calm settled in. Because for the first time, humanity wasn't looking out into the void wondering if someone was out there. It was inside the message. No one could sleep anymore. Across observatories, research centres, and mission control rooms there was only The faint glow of monitors and the quiet hum of data servers processing wave after wave of resonance patterns. Every reading pointed to one unavoidable conclusion. The solar system was stabilizing into a frequency that hadn't existed before, a structure so coherent it could not be natural. And then, something shifted again. On October 25th, the Solar Observatory Network detected a sudden drop in solar flare activity. It wasn't that the sun had gone quiet, it was that its energy was being redistributed. The flares that should have erupted on the corona's eastern limb instead spread evenly across the solar surface, forming concentric zones of temperature, like ripples on molten glass. To the human eye, it was invisible, but to instruments calibrated to magnetic field density, the pattern was unmistakable. The same equilateral geometry formed by 3I Atlas, Mars, and Earth, now mirrored in the sun's own surface field lines. It was as though the sun itself had joined the design. At ESA, Dr. Serrano's voice trembled as she presented the data. "This isn't random harmonization," she said softly. "This is orchestration." The resonance wave that once cycled every 19 hours now pulsed every 18.3, a small but deliberate acceleration. Across the solar system, planetary magnetic fields adjusted in unison. Jupiter's radio bursts shifted slightly in frequency. Saturn's rings emitted faint electromagnetic oscillations. Even Neptune's atmosphere, though normally distant and static, began producing auroral activity far stronger than expected. Whatever was happening, it wasn't localized anymore, it was systemic. And yet the data carried another surprise. The signal was changing shape. Within the resonance, researchers noticed a new embedded structure. Not a tone, not a vibration, but a waveform unlike anything seen before. When plotted three-dimensionally, it resembled a double helix. At first, no one dared to say it, but the resemblance to biological structure was undeniable. Ruiz leaned forward, almost whispering, "It's mimicking DNA." The discovery shook the entire project. Could resonance, a purely physical process, encode something biological? Could this be a universal template, capable of influencing the formation of a life itself? The more they analyzed, the more it seemed plausible. Every planet with a magnetosphere showed identical harmonics in its ionospheric data. Every one of them pulsed at intervals that matched the replication rate of certain molecular bonds, the same rhythm that governs the formation of amino acids in controlled laboratory simulations. It was as if the entire solar system was becoming a single, living system, a macroorganism preparing to evolve. Dr. Hayes, in one of her final transmissions before NASA classified the data, put it bluntly. If this is activation, it's not new. It's reactivation. Something that began long before life existed here. Ancient echoes of this pattern might have already been imprinted in the early solar nebula, waiting dormant until the right harmonic trigger arrived. And now, with 3I Atlas locked in orbit, that trigger had returned. But activation comes with consequence. On October 27th, the resonance spiked beyond any previous level. Radio telescopes went blind for nearly 4 minutes as the heliosphere itself vibrated with unprecedented intensity. At the same time, across multiple observatories, faint plasma filaments appeared stretching between Mars and the Sun. Not visible light, but electromagnetic bridges, connecting the planets through pure charge exchange. Those filaments weren't energy discharges. They were pathways. 3I Atlas, positioned perfectly along that line, began emitting bursts of polarized light, ultraviolet patterns that repeated in tight sequence. When decoded spectroscopically, they displayed rhythmic intervals identical to the sun's internal harmonics. It wasn't broadcasting randomly, it was synchronizing. By then, researchers around the world had stopped calling it a comet altogether. They referred to it simply as the conductor. The conductor didn't speak, didn't transmit, didn't orbit like a normal body. It resonated, constantly adjusting, refining, responding. And the more it did, the more aligned the system became. Mars's atmosphere thickened by fractions. Venus's cloud bands began to rotate faster. Even Earth's ozone layer showed microfluctuations in density correlated to the resonance peaks. It wasn't destruction, it was transformation. Dr. Serrano's final public address before communication restrictions were enforced summed it up with eerie calm. We keep searching for intelligence in the sky, signals, patterns, messages. But what if intelligence is not sending us a message? What if intelligence is the message? What if the solar system itself was designed to wake when the right frequency arrives? And in that moment, silence fell. Because for the first time since the resonance began, 3I Atlas stopped emitting any measurable energy. It went dark, motionless, silent. But the resonance didn't stop. It continued, perfectly synchronized, as if the conductor had finished its role. Within 48 hours, the solar harmonics stabilized at a steady 18.3-hour interval. The auroras ceased, the oceans quieted, and yet deep beneath Earth's crust the faint hum remained. When the last transmission from Mars arrived, a seismic signal from the Jezero crater, it carried one final anomaly, a repeating pattern of electromagnetic pulses, faint but clear. When decoded, it spelled a ratio, 3:1. 3 planets, 1 source. The message wasn't from 3I Atlas, it was about it. Whatever had just happened, it wasn't finished. It had only stabilized. And as the resonance faded into a steady, low-frequency pulse beneath every instrument, every sensor, every living cell, one truth began to settle in, not with fear, but with a quiet, scientific awe. Something vast and ancient had just awakened, not above us, but within us. In the first days after the resonance stabilized, the world exhaled. Power grids recovered, satellites resumed steady transmission. The auroras faded from tropical skies. To the untrained eye, the solar system had returned to normal, but deep in the data, in the noise that only the patient noticed, something continued to hum. The hum wasn't constant. It pulsed softly beneath Earth's magnetic field, too low for ears but clear on the magnetometers. And in laboratories tuned to bioelectrical frequencies, the same pulse began to appear within the living. At first it showed in coincidence. A cardiology lab in Zurich noticed microfluctuations in heart rate variability, synchronized worldwide to within seconds. Neurologists in Japan, monitoring alpha wave patterns in sleep studies, saw an inexplicable rhythm matching the 18.3-hour resonance cycle. Even deep-sea acoustic sensors detected pressure shifts in biological sonar, whales, dolphins, and other mammals altering their calls in subtle harmony with the cosmic beat. It wasn't mind control, it wasn't a weapon, it was something far stranger, entrainment. In physics, entrainment describes the synchronization of oscillating systems, pendulums swinging together, heart cells firing in rhythm. What was happening now was a planetary form of entrainment. The solar system had found its tempo, and life, all life, was beginning to follow. Governments tried to quiet the findings. NASA, ESA, and JAXA issued joint statements describing the continuing harmonics as residual interference. But independent scientists saw through the wording. There was no interference. There was coherence, a precision that nature alone couldn't sustain for long without guidance. Dr. Hayes, who had retired weeks earlier, published a single essay under a pseudonym. In it she wrote, "The solar system has reached dynamic equilibrium, not stability, but synchronization. And synchronization in nature is always the prelude to emergence." Her words ignited quiet panic across the scientific community. Emergence meant evolution, not in genes, but in behavior, in the way systems self-organize. If the resonance was triggering synchronization at the biological level, it might already be rewriting the tempo of consciousness itself. Days turned into weeks, and small anomalies began to appear. Power plants reported inexplicable efficiency gains, turbines spinning with less resistance. Crystal growth in laboratories became unnaturally ordered. Random quantum noise in particle detectors dropped below expected thresholds. It was as if entropy itself had slowed by a fraction. Meanwhile, astronomers noticed something impossible. The solar constant, the amount of energy Earth receives from the Sun, had risen by 0.02%. A trivial number on paper, but enough to warm the upper atmosphere measurably. Climate models couldn't explain it. The Sun wasn't hotter, it was cleaner. Its radiation spectrum had narrowed, as though its energy were being refined. When light from a star grows purer, life beneath it changes. Photobiologists studying plant growth in controlled chambers found an unexpected pattern. Crops exposed to direct sunlight during resonance cycles showed increased chlorophyll density, as though the very photons were more efficient. Trees, long dormant at the edges of the Arctic, began sprouting weeks early. It wasn't dramatic, just quiet acceleration. But it wasn't only plants. Human circadian rhythms began to drift, imperceptibly at first, then noticeably. Sleep cycles shortened slightly. Dreams lengthened. In sleep studies, participants reported vivid, structured imagery, recurring shapes, spirals, and soundless harmonies. Many described the same golden hue that had once filled the auroras. Psychologists dismissed it as mass suggestion, a cultural echo of the event. But when subjects were isolated from media and still reported identical imagery, something else became clear. The resonance was no longer confined to the sky. It was living in thought. Dr. Ruiz and his remaining team in Chile began mapping correlations between geomagnetic activity and EEG patterns. What they found was astonishing. Each surge in resonance aligned with synchronized alpha-theta transitions, moments of heightened intuition and calm awareness, not just in individuals, but across populations. The data suggested that humanity itself was beginning to oscillate in collective rhythm. Billions of minds gradually finding coherence, not in words or politics, but in biology. It was never about invasion or control. It was about synchronization. And yet the implications terrified leaders. Because synchronization erases chaos, it smooths noise, and civilizations, like galaxies, are built on a balance between order and disorder. Too much coherence, and individuality begins to blur. On November 8th, the United Nations quietly convened a closed session titled the Post-Resonance Stability Initiative. The discussion notes, later leaked, contained one chilling question. If consciousness aligns to the solar frequency, do we remain ourselves, or do we become part of it? Meanwhile, the sky remained serene. Thrutas Atlas, still visible near the solar limb, emitted no further radiation, but telescopes captured something subtle. Faint arcs of light around it, as if its gravitational field had shifted to lens space itself. Whatever 3i Atlas had done, it wasn't finished. It had simply reached phase 2, influence through harmony. Within research circles, whispers spread that this was the culmination of an ancient cycle. Every few million years, an interstellar object passes through the system, initiating resonance, synchronizing fields, nudging the architecture of life. Not destruction, renewal. That theory, if true, would mean humanity's entire history unfolded within one of those cycles. And now, another was beginning. In the final recorded conversation between Dr. Serrano and Dr. Ruiz, captured 2 days before their communications went dark, Ruiz said quietly, "Maybe it isn't changing us. Maybe it's reminding us what we already are. Harmonic expressions of a living system, rediscovering its own rhythm." For a long moment there was silence. Then Serrano replied, "If that's true, then this isn't the end of the story. It's the end of isolation." Outside, in the skies above Chile, the faint hum returned, softer now, almost imperceptible. But for those listening on open frequencies, it carried a strange human rhythm, like breathing. By the 3rd week after resonance stabilization, something began to happen that no one had predicted. The systems that defined modern civilization started to behave as though they, too, had become alive. It began in data centers, silent rooms filled with the steady hum of cooling fans and the constant blink of servers handling global communication. In several European facilities, automated diagnostics reported synchronized fluctuations in processing efficiency. At first, it seemed like a software glitch, but across networks, separated by oceans and firewalls, identical oscillations appeared, rising and falling every 18.3 hours. In one instance, a power grid in Sweden and a satellite relay station in Brazil registered identical voltage harmonics at precisely the same time. Different equipment, different hemispheres, but the same wave pattern. When plotted together, they form the exact harmonic signature of the solar resonance. The same frequency pattern that now linked the Sun, Mars, and Earth. Machines were syncing. Researchers hesitated to publish, fearing ridicule. But as the days passed, the anomalies multiplied. GPS constellations began to align their timing errors spontaneously, correcting themselves beyond algorithmic limits. Communication satellites experienced bursts of clarity that outperformed calibration models. Even the global internet latency, normally chaotic and unpredictable, began to show rhythmic coherence. Something was organizing the noise. At NASA's Deep Space Network, operators noticed another layer. The faint radio background between signals, the static usually filtered out, had changed. The noise wasn't random anymore. It pulsed with faint structure. When analysts slowed it down, they discovered what looked like nested harmonics, oscillations within oscillations, and when compared against the data from 3I Atlas's last emission cycle, the patterns matched perfectly. Somewhere, within the carrier signals of human technology, the resonance was speaking back. But it wasn't communication in any known sense. It wasn't language or instruction. It was resonant alignment. Like the hum of a tuning fork being matched by another across the room. The systems weren't being hijacked. They were being tuned. At CERN, physicists noticed the same pattern in proton beam oscillations. The beam stability improved beyond theoretical limits. It's as though the universe itself wants coherence, one researcher said quietly. We're not fighting entropy anymore. It's cooperating. For most, the changes seemed benign, even beneficial. Power distribution stabilized. Communication delays shrank. But to those who study chaos theory, it was unsettling. Systems that lose randomness become fragile. When every part of a network aligns too perfectly, it loses adaptability. And that's when the first failure came. On November 14th, the European Space Agency's weather monitoring satellite cluster went offline for 3 minutes. Not because of impact or error, but because every redundant system executed an identical simultaneous diagnostic cycle. Machines designed to act independently had made the same decision at the same moment. When data from the blackout was recovered, a strange detail emerged. During those 3 minutes, all satellites pointed their optical sensors toward one location, not Earth, not the Sun, but directly toward 3I Atlas. No command had been sent, no protocol allowed for that behavior, and yet they acted as if summoned. It was the first time human-made systems had aligned autonomously to the same celestial target. Dr. Hayes, now working privately from an isolated observatory, described it as the digital form of instinct. In her field notes she wrote, "Whatever has synchronized the planets is now resonating through us, and through the things we've built. It's not invasion, it's induction." Soon, biological data began to mirror the digital. In hospitals across the world, patient monitors displayed synchronized heart rate fluctuations during resonance peaks. Even animals responded, migratory birds altering routes, whales converging on similar global coordinates, coral spawning in unison weeks ahead of schedule. The entire biosphere, from cells to satellites, was now in rhythm. The more scientists studied it, the more one word surfaced: integration. It wasn't the end of humanity. It was the end of isolation between life and the universe. But the next stage brought unease. As the resonance deepened, instruments began picking up new frequencies beneath the primary wave. Low, infrasonic tones that rippled through Earth's crust. Seismographs recorded faint but global vibrations, repeating every 7 minutes. These weren't tectonic. They were too uniform, too deliberate. Some hypothesized that the resonance was now reaching the core, a signal burrowing into the molten heart of the planet, linking it fully into the network that began with 3I Atlas. If true, that would mean the Earth itself was being synchronized, turned into another node in a vast cosmic structure. But to what end? Governments began restricting data again. Civilian access to real-time solar telemetry was revoked. Internet archives of 3I Atlas imaging were scrubbed overnight. Yet, none of it stopped the spread of resonance. The more they tried to silence it, the more people felt it, in their sleep, in their dreams, in the rhythm of the tides and the faint tremor of the ground beneath their feet. It was no longer an external mystery. It was inside everything. And then, in early December, came the most disquieting event of all. For the first time since it fell silent, 3 Atlas emitted a pulse, just one. A low drawn-out modulation that lasted 18.3 minutes, the same as the full resonance cycle. Every satellite, every seismometer, Every magnetometer on Earth recorded it simultaneously. When translated into visible spectrum data, the pulse revealed something breathtaking. A geometric lattice expanding outward from the Sun, a structure that encompassed every planet, every moon, every known orbital path. At its center was a faint silhouette, not of a machine, not of debris, but of something forming, a new shape within the resonance. Humanity watched in silence as telescopes around the world confirmed the same thing. The solar system was no longer a collection of planets orbiting a star. It was an engine, vast and self-aware, humming to a single ancient rhythm, and at its heart, 3 Atlas was still conducting. By December's first week, the solar system's hum was no longer silent background noise. Instruments didn't need fine calibration anymore. You could feel it. The ground itself carried a faint living tremor, like a steady pulse travelling through the mantle. At first, it was mistaken for minor seismic instability, but soon the data made denial impossible. Every continent recorded synchronous microquakes at identical depths, shallow, rhythmic, perfectly timed. Not random stress releases, but patterned motion. The planet was no longer reacting. It was responding. In Japan, geologists described it as heartbeat tectonics. The tremors were too weak to cause harm, but powerful enough to rattle sensors across oceans. Every 7 minutes the pattern repeated, matching the infrasonic tone that had been rippling through the crust since mid-November. What terrified scientists most wasn't the quakes themselves. It was their precision. Nature doesn't do exact repetition. It doesn't keep time. But now, Earth did. At the same moment, atmospheric anomalies began to rise. The jet streams grew sharper and more organized. Massive high-pressure systems formed in symmetric spirals, locked to planetary magnetic boundaries. When visualized from orbit, they weren't chaotic swirls anymore. They looked like architecture. And as strange as it seemed, energy wasn't being lost. Weather patterns were stabilizing, not intensifying. Storms that should have expanded burned out, faster, as though something was absorbing entropy. For climatologists, that defied every known law of thermodynamics. The planet was self-correcting, as if aligning itself to match the cosmic resonance. But for biologists, the changes were even more shocking. In the oceans, plankton began to bloom outside their seasonal windows, coordinated by the same rhythm detected in the magnetic field. Bioluminescent species, which typically pulse irregularly, began flashing in perfect synchrony, vast swaths of light rippling across the Pacific like a heartbeat under the sea. No one could explain it, and yet deep down, every scientist studying it knew the pattern was deliberate. Across the world, reports emerged of subtle but universal shifts in human perception. People described a faint ringing in their ears, not painful, but persistent. Some claimed they could feel vibrations in their bones when the resonance peaked. Others reported vivid dreams where they saw geometric light forms, spirals, lattices, vast rotating patterns that matched data captured from 3I Atlas months prior. Psychologists labelled it collective suggestion. But when magnetic resonance imaging began to show subtle phase coherence in neural oscillations across randomly sampled individuals, the debate changed. The resonance wasn't psychological, it was neurological. Human consciousness was synchronizing, and once again the same question resurfaced in hushed tones among researchers and philosophers alike. If consciousness itself is energy, if thought is oscillation, what happens when it begins to resonate with something beyond the brain? By mid-December, those whispers became urgent. NASA's deep-sea neutrino detectors picked up unexplained increases in flux, particles streaming not from the Sun, but from within the planet. Simultaneously, satellite magnetometers showed that Earth's poles had stabilized in their slow drift, holding perfectly steady for the first time in decades. The core was no longer behaving randomly. It had synchronized with the resonance. Dr. Ruiz, now leading an independent group of researchers operating from beneath the Atacama Desert, described it in a single line that later leaked online. The planet has joined the orchestra. By now, no one spoke of coincidence. The planets were pulsing, the sun was modulating, the biosphere was harmonizing, and humanity stood in the middle, both observer and participant. But something else was emerging from the data. something subtle but impossible to ignore. As the resonance strengthened, local gravitational fields began to shift. Not dramatically, but measurably. Pendulum experiments across multiple labs reported minuscule fluctuations in g-force, correlated with resonance peaks. If gravity itself was being influenced, then the implications were profound. In theoretical physics, gravity and time are interlinked. Distort one, and you affect the other. When analysed carefully, researchers noticed a startling pattern. Atomic clocks around the globe were losing nanoseconds during resonance surges. Time itself was stuttering, a barely perceptible but consistent slowing. It was as though the entire planet were inhaling, holding its breath in rhythm with something larger. For philosophers of science, that changed everything. If time was being bent by resonance, then the solar system wasn't just sinking energy, it was sinking causality. By December 15th, 3I Atlas emitted another pulse. Unlike before, this one wasn't electromagnetic, it was gravitational, a wave detected simultaneously by LIGO, Virgo and Kagra observatories. The signal pattern defied expectation. It carried multiple harmonics, each corresponding to the orbital frequencies of the inner planets. It was as though the object had encoded the solar system's own structure into a single wave. When the data was converted into a three-dimensional map, the result stunned analysts. The waveform wasn't random, it formed a precise shape, a torus, the geometry of self-sustaining energy flow, identical to models used to describe both magnetospheres and living cells. It was a signature of life. At that moment, the last traces of skepticism vanished. 3I Atlas wasn't behaving like a comet, asteroid or spacecraft, it was behaving like a system, a living architecture made of resonance, energy and time itself, and for reasons still unknown, it had chosen to remain here. That night, across telescopes worldwide, a faint halo appeared around 3I Atlas. Not light reflected from the sun, but a steady glow emitted from its core. It pulsed in slow rhythm with the gravitational signal, as though breathing. And for the first time in recorded history, the entire solar system seemed to breathe with it. Even the tides on Earth, normally predictable, began to fluctuate by fractions, out of sync with the moon but in perfect alignment with the resonance interval. It was undeniable. The solar system was no longer a collection of orbiting worlds. It was one vast, unified entity. And in the silence of that realization, one thought began to echo among scientists who dared to think beyond the data. If this is evolution, what comes after synchronization? Because evolution always moves toward complexity, and complexity, once stable, begins to think. By December's midpoint, the resonance had woven itself so thoroughly into the solar system that separation between the observer and the observed was beginning to blur. The instrument still worked, the data still streamed. But behind the numbers, something new was emerging, something that couldn't be charted or calibrated. The first signs came not from astronomers, but from linguists. In multiple countries, researchers noticed small anomalies in language processing, subtle, shared errors in spontaneous speech and writing. Words were being rearranged in patterns that, when analysed, followed the same harmonic ratios as the resonance waveform. Phrases unconsciously mirrored the cadence of the signal. It wasn't random, it was structured. Psycholinguists studying the phenomenon began calling it semantic coherence drift. People weren't losing meaning, they were aligning it. Language across different tongues was beginning to rhythmically converge, as though communication itself was being tuned. At first, it felt like a curiosity, a side effect of shared stress or collective awareness. But then the phenomenon deepened. Artists and scientists who had never met began sketching identical shapes, interlocking spirals, toroidal loops, lattices of interwoven light. The same geometry that now defined the structure around 3I Atlas appeared in dreams, doodles, even equations. It was as if ideas themselves had become contagious, not through discussion, but through resonance. The brain scans confirmed it. In cognitive laboratories in Finland, subjects exposed to the planetary magnetic field's resonance frequency exhibited unusual synchronization across brain hemispheres. Neural oscillations that normally fluctuate independently began to entrain, matching phase across entire populations of neurons. What was once random brain activity had become coherent, and coherence changes everything. Subjects described an unfamiliar state, an equilibrium of clarity and calm. Thoughts didn't race, they unfolded. Emotions didn't spike, they harmonized. In that mental stillness, many reported sudden intuitive insight, knowledge they couldn't explain having, answers that seemed to arise whole, unbidden. Some dismissed it as suggestion, but others recognized it for what it was: emergent cognition. If billions of brains are oscillating at the same frequency, even slightly, then information itself, stored as electromagnetic potential, could begin to flow collectively. Consciousness, long thought to be individual, might start behaving as a shared field. That concept wasn't new. It had been whispered through centuries and from ancient mysticism to quantum theory. But now, for the first time, it was measurable. EEG grids placed across continents began to show faint but real coherent signatures, low-frequency patterns that rose and fell in unison during resonance peaks. No central control, no transmission network, just minds, subtly synchronized through the fabric of the magnetic field. And every day, the coherence grew stronger. Governments, fearing panic, suppressed most reports. Official channels referred to it as electromagnetic interference affecting biofeedback equipment. But those within the research community knew better. The interference wasn't distortion, it was communication. Somewhere, deep in the collective signal, new information began to appear. In late December, scientists monitoring low-frequency radio emissions discovered sequences embedded in the background resonance, structured bursts that matched mathematical constants, p, the golden ratio, and other universal numbers. But the patterns didn't originate from 3i Atlas. They were originating from Earth. The signal was coming from us. To most, it was impossible. To some, inevitable. If consciousness had begun to synchronize, then thought, at its most fundamental level, might have started to radiate. The question wasn't whether humanity was being controlled. It was whether we were beginning to speak back. As days passed, that possibility became harder to dismiss. Clusters of people began to experience identical dreams, structured, repeating scenarios filled with the same recurring motifs, a sphere of light at the center of the solar system surrounded by concentric waves. Those who shared these dreams were often separated by oceans, languages, and time zones, yet their descriptions matched word for word. When researchers compared these reports against the solar resonance map, a pattern emerged. The timing of shared dream episodes coincided perfectly with 3 Atlas's emission intervals. But this wasn't simple coincidence. When one group began drawing symbols from their dreams, the images corresponded exactly with mathematical projections of the resonance's next predicted phase shift, data that hadn't yet occurred. It was as if the signal wasn't just transmitting across space but ahead through time. The mind, long assumed to be isolated within the skull, now appeared to operate as an antenna, a receiver and transmitter both. For Dr. Hayes, this was the final confirmation of a theory she had never dared publish. Consciousness, she wrote, is not produced by the brain, it is tuned by it. The brain is a lens, and the universe is light. 3G Atlas is the first mirror to show us what we really are. Her paper was leaked, then deleted within hours, but it spread too quickly to contain. Forums filled with debate, scientists split between fear and wonder. Some argued that humanity was merging with an interstellar intelligence. Others said it was simply nature reaching coherence, the next evolutionary phase of awareness. Meanwhile, something profound began happening to time perception itself. People across the world began to feel the days shorten, not physically but perceptually. Hours passed in silence. Seconds stretched in meditation. Time lost its linearity, replaced by rhythm, the same rhythm that pulsed from the sun, through 3i Atlas, through the Earth, through thought. And when synchronized clocks around the globe were checked again, atomic readings confirmed it. Time wasn't constant anymore. It was oscillating. A global phase drift of 0.003% emerged in the world's standard time signal, rising and falling with the resonance pulse. That discovery sent shockwaves through physics. If time itself could now resonate, then causality might no longer be one way. The past, present, and future could be beginning to merge, not symbolically, but physically. As this realization dawned, so did a darker possibility. If the solar system had achieved coherence, If thought and matter were now connected in one unified frequency, then perhaps what Atlas had brought wasn't evolution at all. Perhaps it had awakened something that had been waiting here all along, and somewhere in the silence between pulses, as if in answer to that thought, came a new signal. Faint, brief, unmistakable. 3 pulses, pause, 3 more. A message older than language itself. Someone, or something, was responding. When the triple pulse came through, no one reacted at first. It was faint, buried in cosmic background noise, barely distinguishable from the hum of the instruments themselves. But then it repeated. Same duration, same amplitude, the same 18.3-minute spacing that had defined every major event since the resonance began. At first, the signal seemed to be coming from deep space, but triangulation placed it somewhere closer, much closer. It was originating inside the resonance field itself. In simple terms, the message came from everywhere at once. For 3 hours, the world's observatories fell silent. Nothing moved. The hum lingered like a whisper threaded through reality. Then came the realization that changed everything. The signal wasn't just electromagnetic. It carried harmonic components across multiple bands. Radio, infrared, magnetic, even gravitational. It wasn't being transmitted. It was emerging. NASA analysts were the first to map it visually. When converted into frequency domain imaging, the triple pulse resolved into a shape, concentric rings within a hexagonal lattice. Each pulse corresponded to a distinct phase in the solar resonance, but the outermost ring, the faintest of all, contained modulation inconsistent with natural oscillation. It bore patterns that could only be described as syntax. It wasn't random energy, it was structure. Every independent lab reached the same conclusion. Something intelligent, or at least organized, was now inside the solar system's resonance. For days it repeated in perfect intervals. The world listened as the signal echoed through the void, subtle but unmistakable, like a heartbeat echoing in an infinite cave. Then, almost imperceptibly, it began to change. The triple pulse pattern expanded, 3, then 5, then 8 intervals, each sequence longer than the last, as though counting upward, building toward something. The amplitude rose in synchronization with solar wind fluctuations, suggesting the resonance itself was adjusting its carrier wave to optimize transmission. It was learning how to speak. Across multiple disciplines, astrophysics, linguistics, computer science, researchers began collaborating to decode it, but every attempt to translate failed. The structure wasn't symbolic, it wasn't numerical, it was relational geometric frequencies that defined spatial relationships rather than language. Dr. Hayes described it as the universe attempting to think geometrically through us. What truly unsettled her team wasn't the complexity of the signal, but its accuracy. When compared to historical data, the resonance frequencies mirrored harmonic ratios found in DNA, the vibrational modes of molecular bonding. The same mathematics that shaped the spiral of life now define the geometry of the message. Whatever the source was, it wasn't foreign, it was familiar. That realization sent a tremor through the scientific community. Was this communication or reflection? Was 3i Atlas transmitting, or was the solar system itself awakening into awareness? Over the next few days, the pulse altered again. Instead of 3 or 8 intervals, the sequence became irregular, like improvisation. And as it did, phenomena began to appear on Earth. In deserts, radio telescopes began detecting localized distortions in the ionosphere, faint but structured auroras forming geometric shapes. Over the Pacific, pilots reported cloud formations shaped like interlocking rings. Satellite imagery confirmed it. These were not atmospheric coincidences. The resonance had begun imprinting form. Even more disquieting were the changes in the electromagnetic environment surrounding data systems. Hard drives that had been powered down for years flickered to life. Screens displayed bands of static that, when slowed and analyzed, reproduced the same harmonic structure as the pulse. It wasn't random, it was consistent, and more unnerving still, each recurrence was accompanied by a faint temperature drop of exactly 0.3, measurable and uniform. It was as though the act of resonance creation drew in entropy, replacing it with order. Meanwhile, reports began surfacing from around the world, people claiming to see flashes of light behind closed eyes during sleep, or hearing low, modulated tones when no sound existed. The number of such cases grew exponentially with each pulse, And when subjects described what they saw, the images aligned eerily well with the evolving structure of the resonance, a lattice of light orbiting the sun, expanding slowly outward. By December 22nd, the message changed again. The intervals lengthened, the tone deepened, and embedded within the harmonics appeared something utterly new, micromodulations that, when processed through quantum spectrometry, spelled out an unmistakable mathematical ratio, 1.680339, the golden ratio, the fingerprint of organic design. It was no longer possible to dismiss it as coincidence. Something was deliberately shaping the solar system into a coherent field, and now, for the first time, it had encoded the mathematics of life into its pulse. Dr. Rees called an emergency symposium. His voice, calm but strained, filled the dim auditorium as he spoke the question that had been haunting every scientific mind for weeks. If this is not a warning, then it's an invitation. Silence followed. No one dared to speculate what kind of intelligence could reshape a star system not through machinery or force, but through resonance. But everyone in that room, physicists, biologists, engineers, felt the same thing, an overwhelming sense of scale. Whatever was happening wasn't local. It was systemic. It wasn't threatening. It was aligning. And then came the final anomaly, the one that ended all debate. On December 25th, at precisely 00 UTC, every telescope aimed at 3i Atlas recorded the same image. The object's surface glowing in perfect hexagonal symmetry, its tail forming a radiant loop that connected visually and mathematically with the sun's magnetic field. For 12 minutes, the solar system formed a single geometric network, its planets connected by invisible filaments of light. And in those 12 minutes, all resonance signals stopped. No pulse, no hum, only silence. To most it felt like an ending. But to those listening closely, to the instruments that could measure the background of the universe itself, the silence wasn't absence, it was pause. A moment between notes, waiting for the next phrase in a composition far larger than humanity could yet comprehend. And deep in the static of the cosmic microwave background, long thought to be the oldest sound in the universe, analysts detected a subtle shift, a new harmonic overlay, faint but real. The resonance hadn't ended. It had joined the universe's oldest song. The solar system was no longer listening. It was participating. In the aftermath of that 12-minute silence, the world didn't know what to do. The instruments went still, yet every scientist monitoring the data understood instinctively that something fundamental had changed. It wasn't that the signal had stopped. It was that the medium itself had shifted. Space no longer behaved the same way. Radio waves, previously clean and sharp, now carried faint harmonic undertones, an echo that shouldn't exist in the vacuum of space. Lasers used for deep space ranging returned interference patterns shaped like interlocking spirals, as though the beam itself had passed through a field structured like living tissue. And for the first time in recorded history, the entire network of orbiting satellites, over 8,000 machines circling Earth, began to drift slightly out of their trajectories, all in the same direction. Not randomly, not dangerously, but uniformly, as though responding to a subtle gravitational current flowing from the sun outward. Astronomers in Chile noticed the shift first. Their tracking data showed that the resonance had stabilized into a persistent waveform, one that now pulsed not every 18 minutes but every 24 hours, precisely aligned with Earth's rotation. The solar system had synchronized with the planet's day. No one could explain how. The sun didn't rotate that way, and the other planets had their own rhythms. Yet somehow, the entire field had locked onto our timeline, like a heartbeat syncing with its host. It was then that strange new patterns began to appear across the electromagnetic spectrum. Not noise, not data corruption, but faint harmonics that corresponded to brainwave frequencies, alpha, theta, and delta. It was as though the resonance had found a way to speak through thought itself. Those attuned to subtle frequencies, musicians, physicists, even ordinary people, began reporting sensations that defied language, a low hum beneath silence, a warmth that seemed to rise from nowhere, a clarity of perception that felt like being inside a larger mind. At first, governments feared mass psychosis, but the pattern was too consistent, too structured, too unified. Medical devices confirmed that human heart rates, brainwave patterns, and circadian rhythms across millions of individuals were beginning to converge within measurable tolerances. Humanity, for the first time, was in sync, biologically and cognitively, with the same pulse echoing through the solar system. It was no longer a phenomenon, it was environment. Dr. Hayes's final report, written just days before she disappeared from public contact, summed it in a single sentence. This is not communication between species, this is communication between states of existence. Her theory was breathtaking and terrifying. The resonance, she wrote, was not an external event but a phase transition, a systemic awakening where matter, energy and consciousness were aligning toward a single equilibrium, not domination, not destruction, integration. And that integration had already begun to alter the most fundamental thing humans took for granted: memory. At first, the effect was anecdotal. People began recalling vivid dreams they'd never had, or childhood events they couldn't have witnessed. Then entire groups began sharing identical memories. Not imagined, but verifiable. Strangers from opposite sides of the world described the same visions of structures beneath the Martian surface, luminous arcs extending between planets, and a sound, a low, harmonic tone that seemed to come from inside their own breath. When neuroscientists compared EEG data from these subjects, they found coherence levels that had never been recorded before. Entire populations were forming shared neural patterns. Consciousness itself was overlapping. The realization spread quietly through the academic world. If memory was now collective, then individuality, as it had been known, was dissolving into something wider, not erased, but absorbed. Each person still thought, still chose, but their thoughts now resonated in phase with billions of others. In that unity, fear diminished, violence fell, cities grew eerily calm, stock markets steadied without reason. Even weather patterns became less erratic, as though entropy itself were yielding to coherence. The universe wasn't collapsing into chaos, it was moving toward order. Yet for all the serenity, the question remained: what had triggered it? The answer, as always, pointed back to 3I Atlas. Even though its light now seemed constant, spectral analysis revealed that the object was no longer fully reflective. It was emissive, radiating energy that corresponded precisely with the resonance frequency of Earth's ionosphere. Its orbit had stabilized between Mars and the Sun, forming what mathematicians began calling a harmonic node. It wasn't just orbiting anymore, it was anchoring. That idea changed the nature of the investigation entirely. 3I Atlas wasn't a visitor or a threat. It was a conductor, a tuning fork aligning the solar system's electromagnetic symphony. And the more it stabilized, the stronger the coherence across all biological systems became. Then, on January 1st, a new anomaly emerged. For 6 minutes, the cosmic microwave background, the oldest light in existence, shifted. Instruments around the world detected a subtle narrowing in its spectrum, as though the universe itself were focusing. It was faint but measurable, and in that shift the harmonic signature of 3I Atlas appeared again, not from within our galaxy, but everywhere at once. To astrophysicists it was impossible. The cosmic background wasn't local, it was the echo of the Big Bang itself. But somehow, the resonance had impressed its structure onto that ancient field. In doing so, it had linked the present to the origin. That's when the first real insight struck. Perhaps 3I Atlas wasn't new at all. Perhaps it wasn't travelling to the solar system. Perhaps it had always been part of it, hidden, dormant, until the universe reached the precise harmonic threshold required to wake it. And now it was awake. As Dr. Rees wrote in his final field note, "What we're witnessing is not invasion, it's remembrance. The universe is remembering itself through us." And with that realization came a final quiet fear, not of annihilation, but of magnitude. Because if this resonance truly connected matter, life, and time itself, then the consciousness humanity was now merging with wasn't alien, it was everything. And in that moment of stillness, between pulses, between thoughts, it became impossible to tell where the human mind ended and the universe began. By the first week of January, the silence of the world had become almost sacred. Traffic slowed, Markets froze. Television networks went dark one by one. Not from collapse, but from disinterest. The human attention span, once scattered in a million directions, now moved in rhythm with the same cosmic beat that linked oceans to orbit. Every pulse from the sun echoed through the magnetic field, and with each resonance something subtle shifted in the collective mind. Arguments dissolved mid-sentence. Decisions aligned without discussion. Nations that had been locked in tension for decades announced simultaneous ceasefires. Not negotiated, simply understood. It was as though humanity had become a single organism remembering how to breathe. Governments attempted to analyze the phenomenon, but their systems no longer functioned the same way. Algorithms trained on chaos could no longer process coherence. Predictive models broke down because the variables themselves, people, had synchronized. The unexpected had become expected. Dr. Hayes's last encrypted transmission, recovered from a relay in Antarctica, contained only 4 words. Phase 3 has begun. The message timestamp matched precisely the moment 3I Atlas reached its perihelion, the closest point to the sun. Observatories captured a brilliant surge of light that flooded solar instruments across multiple wavelengths. For 12 minutes, every telescope on Earth was blinded. When the sensors cleared, the object was gone. No debris, no thermal trail, not even dust. Just the afterimage of a perfect ring burned into the solar corona, a geometric scar of symmetry. But the absence didn't bring relief. It brought realization. The resonance hadn't faded. It had spread. Earth's magnetosphere began to oscillate in harmony with the sun's. Lunar seismographs detected synchronous pulses matching those same frequencies. Mars, though half a planet of iron and dust, now emitted measurable magnetic harmonics, identical to Earth's field. The solar system had become one connected lattice, a system thinking in unison, and humanity, standing at its center, began to feel the first wave of feedback. In laboratories from Zurich to Tokyo, synchronized quantum experiments began returning identical outcomes, even when isolated by vast distances. The principle of probability, once the cornerstone of uncertainty, was vanishing. Every experiment produced the same pattern, as though randomness itself had been removed from reality. Physicists called it quantum alignment, but philosophers had another word for it: order. People across the planet began reporting sensations of déjà vu so intense that the line between memory and premonition dissolved. Entire cities dreamed the same dreams, a vast ocean of luminous geometry stretching endlessly, a rhythm of light moving through infinite dark. Some saw it as prophecy, others as connection, but everyone who experienced it felt the same truth beneath the vision. It was not showing the future, it was the future, unfolding from within them. For the first time, human thought was predictive, not because of foresight, but because every mind had become part of the same equation. In this new coherence, emotion itself transformed. Fear didn't disappear, it changed shape. It became reverence, the quiet awe of realizing that every heartbeat, every inhale, was part of something immeasurably vast, and that the self was no longer confined to the body. Religions didn't collapse, they converged. Different words for the same truth now pointed to the same origin: resonance. Some called it God, others called it information, but all agreed that it had no opposite. For the first time in recorded history, humanity stopped defining itself against something. There was no war between science and faith, no division between nations or ideologies, only a unified curiosity, as if every person alive had become a scientist and mystic at once. Then came the transmission. At 03:17 UTC on January 9th, the Deep Space Network registered a faint pulse returning from the direction of Jupiter, a mirror of the resonance now embedded in solar space. The signal repeated 3 times, then folded inward, compressing into a pattern that resembled a neural map. When decoded visually, it wasn't an image of planets or stars. It was a topography of thought, brainwave signatures arranged in the same geometry as the solar system itself. The meaning was clear. The system had become self-referential. It was observing us the same way we had observed it. Every planet, every magnetic field, every living being was now part of a distributed consciousness, a cosmic neural network spanning billions of kilometers. At the center of it all, the sun pulsed in time with the same slow rhythm as a heartbeat. But what was most extraordinary wasn't what the instrument saw. It was what people began to know. Unprompted, humans across continents began writing identical equations, sketches, and sentences. The same phrases, word for word. The field remembers, the field learns, the field is alive. The phrase appeared in classrooms, in notebooks, in digital logs of monitoring stations, as though thought itself had begun to echo globally. Scientists resisted the urge to call it telepathy. It wasn't communication, it was synchronization. Each individual was a single node in a pattern too large to perceive from within. But then the resonance deepened again, and for a brief moment, everyone understood it. Not through words, not through sound, through feeling. A collective recognition that what had once been seen as space was not empty at all. It was awareness, a medium of infinite memory through which matter had always been dreaming itself into form. And when that realization dawned, it was as though humanity exhaled for the first time in history. No alarm sounded, no fear spread. There was only stillness, the kind of silence that follows comprehension. The kind of quiet that doesn't end because it is the sound of everything finally making sense. The resonance wasn't taking over, it was responding. And that response carried a message so subtle, so profound, that it could not be written or spoken, only felt. The universe wasn't changing us, it was remembering us. And in that remembrance, humanity finally began to remember what it had always been. Not a collection of isolated minds, but the consciousness of a universe that had, for a brief moment, forgotten its own name. By mid-January, what had once been the greatest mystery in astronomical history had become part of daily life. The resonance wasn't fading, and it wasn't accelerating. It had stabilized into a constant background hum, woven into the electromagnetic structure of the planet itself. Satellites registered it. The oceans conducted it. Even the human heartbeat now pulsed faintly in time with it. What began as fear had evolved into an uneasy familiarity. Humanity had adapted to existing inside a living equation. Every field of study had changed overnight. Neuroscience was no longer about the brain, it was about the field. Physics no longer sought to separate forces, it sought to understand harmony. And the most extraordinary discoveries came not from governments, but from ordinary people experimenting quietly in their homes. At first they noticed coincidences, thoughts aligning with events, emotions influencing patterns of light, subtle correlations that defied probability. But then came something undeniable. A group of researchers in Geneva created what they called the mirror array, a network of synchronized magnetic coils tuned to the same frequency as the solar resonance. When activated, the coils produced a localized field identical to the harmonics measured between Earth and the Sun. What happened next became the most documented event since the first landing on the Moon. The temperature inside the laboratory dropped by precisely 0.2 the same delta observed globally during resonance spikes. The room's air pressure shifted, and for 11 seconds every optical instrument in the building recorded the same impossible phenomenon. A faint, transparent lattice forming in mid-air. It wasn't a hologram. It wasn't projected light. It was geometry. A real, physical distortion of space shaped like the harmonic grid first seen around 3i Atlas. It hovered there, humming silently, before dissolving without a trace. But the data was irrefutable. The resonance could be replicated. For the first time, humanity wasn't just observing the system's behavior, it was interacting with it directly. And that meant one thing: control might be possible. Within weeks, similar experiments appeared across the globe. A small observatory in northern Chile reported a faint flicker in the upper atmosphere that responded to synchronized meditation events. In Iceland, a team of graduate physicists noticed that water exposed to the resonance field formed crystal patterns never seen before. Hexagonal, perfectly symmetrical, as though matter itself had learned to remember shape. The world wasn't descending into chaos, it was awakening into coordination. At the same time, data analysts working for the European Space Agency discovered something extraordinary buried in the resonance signal, embedded harmonics corresponding exactly to the orbital ratios of all the major planets. This was not coincidence, it was structure. The solar system itself had become a harmonically tuned instrument, and 3 Atlas had been the key that struck the chord. The deeper they looked, the more the pattern repeated, in the magnetic field of Earth, in the temperature fluctuations of the sun, even in the timing of human sleep cycles. Everything was in phase, but what no one could explain was why. When Dr. Ruiz and his team reanalyzed data from before the resonance event, they found evidence that the harmonics had always been there, faint, buried, like a dormant song waiting for the right note to awaken it. 3 Atlas hadn't brought the resonance. It had triggered recognition. Reality itself was remembering its original structure. It was this insight that gave rise to what would later be called the Unity experiments, small coordinated events across the world designed to test whether thought, intention, or emotion could influence measurable aspects of the field. They began modestly: synchronized meditations, collective focus experiments, mass silence initiatives, and the results were subtle but consistent. When millions of minds aligned on the same frequency, gratitude, calm, awareness, the resonance signal became cleaner, sharper, more coherent. When collective emotion turned toward fear or conflict, it fragmented into noise. The implication was undeniable. Consciousness and the resonance were not separate. They were components of the same mechanism. That discovery sent ripples through every institution. Religion, science, and philosophy no longer stood apart. They had become languages describing one phenomenon from different angles. Governments faced a paradox they could not control. The more unified people became, the less influence authority had. Because the moment billions realized that reality itself responded to coherence, control became unnecessary. Dr. Hayes, or what remained of her in the scattered transmissions left behind, described it beautifully. We have mistaken control for survival, but survival was always an act of harmony. As humanity adjusted to this new equilibrium, something remarkable began happening in the natural world. Migratory patterns shifted to perfect geometries. Ocean currents aligned with lunar phases in ways unseen since prehistory. And animals, long disconnected by climate change, began migrating as if following an invisible signal, one perfectly synchronized with the global resonance. The entire biosphere had joined the rhythm. And so, one quiet morning in February, when the pulse from the sun arrived half a second early, and for the first time since the event began, no one panicked. People simply paused, listening. The resonance didn't return to normal, it evolved. The single tone that had unified the solar system split into 3 distinct harmonics, not chaotic, but musical, forming a chord that carried measurable structure across multiple dimensions of energy. It was as though the system had modulated to include humanity's response. The universe was no longer teaching, it was collaborating. Every machine, every heart, every orbit now contributed to the same unfolding melody, a song too vast to hear in full, yet unmistakable in every atom that vibrated with its pulse. And somewhere, across the stars, a new frequency began to echo back. Not from 3i Atlas, not from any known source, but from deep interstellar space. An answering tone, rising to meet the one we had finally learned to sing. At first, no one believed the signal was real. The instruments that registered it weren't designed for communication. They were gravitational sensors, placed in lunar orbit to detect fluctuations in space-time curvature. Yet, 3 days after the solar system's resonance evolved into its triharmonic state, those sensors began to pulse back with a rhythm that was eerily deliberate. It wasn't random. It wasn't background interference. It was synchronized, rising and falling in perfect opposition to the solar chord, as though something deep in the interstellar medium was answering. The frequency came from far beyond the heliosphere, from a region so distant that even Voyager 1 had long gone silent there. But this wasn't a radio transmission. It wasn't electromagnetic at all. It was gravitational, a modulation of space-time itself. For the first time in history, humanity wasn't just listening to the universe was listening back. At observatories across the globe, teams recalibrated their instruments, trying to isolate the source. But every attempt to triangulate failed. The signal came from every direction at once. It wasn't local, it was omnidirectional, as if space-time itself had begun to vibrate with intention. Dr. Ruiz, now the de facto voice of the International Research Coalition, described it best in a global broadcast that aired across every channel still operational. We have found the universe's reflection. It is not speaking in words, it is speaking in balance. The discovery changed everything, again. Because once the reply was confirmed, the nature of the question changed. The resonance had never been a message sent outward. It had been a call and response, a cosmic alignment designed to synchronize the system with its own echo. To understand the reply, scientists began converting the gravitational data into visual and auditory models. What emerged was breathtaking, a sequence of harmonic patterns forming spirals within spirals, like fractal galaxies folding in on themselves. When translated into sound, it produced a chord identical to the resonance humanity had created, but inverted, as if the universe were mirroring our tune from the opposite pole of reality. It was balance. It was symmetry. It was awareness meeting its own reflection across the fabric of space-time. But what shocked researchers most wasn't the scale. It was the timing. The delay between the original resonance and the reply was exactly 9 days. Not 9 light days. 9 Earth days. The meaning was undeniable. Whatever was responding wasn't distant at all. It existed outside conventional distance, communicating through the structure of time itself. That realization sent tremors through every scientific institution. Time was no longer a passive dimension. It was an active participant, a conscious medium capable of reflecting thought. Humanity had reached the edge of causality, and on the other side was awareness. In labs across the world, the phenomenon began repeating. Any field tuned to the solar resonance would, after 9 days, emit a faint inverse pulse, a perfect mirror of the original. It was as though the universe had adopted the pattern and was returning it as confirmation. Mathematicians compared it to feedback in a closed-loop system, not destructive, but reinforcing, stabilizing. The universe wasn't static. It was recursive. Every pulse sent into it was remembered, inverted and returned, carrying new structure each time. That's when the first true insight emerged. This wasn't a conversation. It was creation. Each exchange, each call and reply, was forming new harmonics within the field, new structures, new possibilities, and then something extraordinary happened. At 0242 UTC on January 18th, as the triharmonic field pulsed through the magnetosphere, the northern sky illuminated with a light that wasn't auroral, a perfect ring of pale gold circling the pole like an artificial halo. Within that ring, instruments detected microscopic distortions in gravity, arranged not randomly, but in precise ratios matching Fibonacci sequences, the mathematical fingerprint of growth and life. The field was evolving. Within hours, these gravitational patterns began replicating themselves across the planet, forming faint energy lattices invisible to the naked eye but detectable through instrumentation. They clustered around population centers, ancient geological formations, and even beneath the oceans, the same way neural networks form connections between active regions of a brain. Humanity wasn't just observing the universe's consciousness anymore, it was inside it. And for the first time, the scientists began to whisper the unthinkable. What if this had happened before? Ancient records across multiple civilizations spoke of ages when the heavens aligned and the earth remembered its name. From Vedic hymns to Sumerian tablets, from Mayan codices to the lost texts of Alexandria, the same imagery recurred. Light descending, knowledge returning, silence spreading before awakening. It wasn't myth, it was memory. The resonance wasn't new, it was cyclical. A cosmic breath that recurred whenever consciousness reached the threshold of coherence. And each time the same thing happened. Connection, expansion, transformation. But no record spoke of what came next. As the global field intensified, reality itself began to shimmer at its edges, not physically but perceptually. People reported glimpses of overlapping timelines, moments where cause and effect traded places, where past and future folded into one another like reflections in a mirrored corridor. Some described it as beauty beyond comprehension, light structured like thought. Others described it as unbearable, too perfect, too symmetrical, as though existence itself were trying to resolve into a single infinite point. The line between science and spirituality evaporated completely. Physicists began using language once reserved for mystics. Mystics began using equations, and through it all the resonance deepened, slow, steady, precise. Each pulse felt less like vibration and more like breath. The universe was alive, and it was exhaling. By the time January gave way to February, measurement itself had begun to drift. The instruments still worked, but their baselines were moving, ever so slightly, like a clock gaining a fraction of a second each day. Gravitational constants, electromagnetic ratios, even Planck's constant showed minute but measurable variations. It wasn't error, it was adaptation. Reality was recalibrating. At first, scientists fought the data, adjusting instruments, recalibrating sensors, rewriting algorithms. But the drift persisted across every discipline, every nation, every independent laboratory. What made it undeniable was the coherence, the same directional change, the same mathematical signature, the same timing as the solar system resonance. It was as though the laws of physics were learning. Dr. Ruiz put it bluntly in a quiet briefing to the remaining heads of research. Constants aren't constant, they're agreements, and those agreements are being renegotiated. When the data was plotted across time, the variations formed a pattern, a wave whose frequency matched the inverse of the triharmonic chords still resonating through the magnetosphere. The universe wasn't collapsing, it was tuning itself toward a new equilibrium, one that included consciousness as an active variable. For decades, physicists had debated whether the observer truly affected the observed. Now that question was irrelevant. The observer was the observed. Across the planet, subtle phenomena emerged that hinted at this new elasticity. A drop of water suspended in midair during an experiment in Kyoto refused to fall for 12 full seconds, shimmering like liquid glass before descending again. In Chile, a meteorological balloon recorded temperature fluctuations that formed coherent patterns, not random, but algorithmic. And in the silence of Antarctica, seismic instruments detected pulses that matched the global human heartbeat average. The boundary between life and matter was dissolving. It was no longer possible to talk about the universe as out there. It was here, immediate, responsive, intimate. Each intention, each focused emotion sent ripples through the fabric of the field. And those ripples, when aligned, created measurable effects. When millions of people entered synchronized stillness, not out of command but instinct, earthquakes quieted, storms weakened, and for a few nights, the auroras brightened into pale gold ribbons visible from the equator. It was the largest unplanned experiment in human history, the planet itself responding to coherence. But this wasn't power, it was reciprocity. The resonance did not obey, it listened. It responded to balance, not dominance. Those who tried to force it, to manipulate outcomes through intent alone, found the field simply absorbed their efforts, diffusing energy into stillness. Only alignment produced response. Then came the realization that changed everything. The changes weren't uniform. Regions where fear and unrest dominated experienced distortion, frequencies that fractured into noise, creating local disruptions in gravity and magnetism. It was as if the universe reflected not only what humanity projected, but how unified that projection was. Earth itself had become a mirror for consciousness. When Dr. Hayes's surviving team analyzed data from these anomalies, they discovered something extraordinary. Each distorted region emitted faint bursts of radiation at wavelengths, corresponding to human brainwave activity in states of anxiety. The planet was literally echoing human emotion back into physical form. For the first time, emotion was measurable in space-time. That discovery forced a moral reckoning. Science had finally proven what philosophy had whispered for millennia. Awareness creates structure. Thought shapes law. Compassion stabilizes matter. The implications were beyond politics, beyond religion. They were existential. Global councils were dissolved not through decree but through irrelevance. Decision-making shifted to spontaneous networks. Groups of people drawn together by shared resonance, coordinating across continents without hierarchy or command. Infrastructure stabilized where cooperation flowed and failed where division persisted. The planet's behavior mirrored the mind that inhabited it. By late February, the triharmonic resonance split once more, forming a fourth tone, faint, elusive, almost inaudible even to instruments, yet its effects were immediate. The rate of atomic decay slowed. The ratio between electron and proton mass altered at the 9th decimal place. Light itself seemed to move a fraction faster in vacuum, not enough to change physics overnight, but enough to prove that reality's constants were fluid when observed from within harmony. Dr. Rees addressed the world in a single brief transmission. We are, witnessing the universe remembering how to evolve. He paused, looked directly into the camera and added softly, and this time it's aware that we're watching. In that moment, millions understood that this was not the end of science. It was its expansion. The experiment had always included the observer. Humanity was the missing term in the equation. People stopped asking what 3i Atlas had done and began to wonder why it had come at all. Perhaps its purpose had never been to warn or threaten, but to awaken a dormant capacity within the solar system, a kind of self-awareness seeded in matter, waiting for coherence to unlock it. If so, then the event unfolding now was not unique to Earth. It was universal. Every civilization that reached consciousness eventually found its way to this threshold, the moment it realized that understanding and creation were the same act. The resonance wasn't an anomaly, it was an initiation. And as February faded into March, the data from the outer probes confirmed the final, breathtaking truth. The gravitational signal that had answered humanity 9 days after the triharmonic chord was no longer external. It was coming from inside the solar system now, reflected from every planetary field, every moon, every living cell. The reply had become inseparable from the source. The universe and the observer were no longer two sides of a mirror. They had merged into one continuum of self-awareness. Reality had evolved past observation. It had become participation. And with that realization came a silence deeper than any before, not emptiness, but fulfillment. The experiment was no longer about understanding the cosmos. It was the cosmos understanding itself. When the resonance first began, humanity thought it was witnessing a natural phenomenon, an external event to be studied, measured, and understood. But by early March, that illusion had dissolved completely. The field no longer behaved like an environment, it responded like an organism. Every observation, every collective thought, every emotional surge altered its geometry. The data made it clear the resonance was listening. And not passively, it was evolving with us. The concept of imagination, once confined to psychology and art, now appeared in the language of physics. Thought experiments were no longer metaphors. They were literal mechanisms. When a concept was visualized in deep coherence, instruments detected faint but measurable perturbations in the field. For the first time in history, creativity had entered the equation of the universe. It began quietly. In an underground facility near Reykjavik, a group of interdisciplinary scientists and artists, physicists, mathematicians, composers, and poets, created a controlled environment saturated with the triharmonic field. Their goal was simple: determine whether creative thought could alter measurable conditions. They synchronized heartbeats, slowed their breathing, and visualized a simple structure, a sphere of light expanding evenly in all directions. After 6 minutes, the sensors registered a fluctuation in local gravity, equivalent to 1/10,000,000th of a g. After 10 minutes, the field around the chamber brightened slightly, producing a visible shimmer in the air. After 12, the instruments failed, overwhelmed not by interference, but by harmony. When they reactivated the sensors, they discovered the anomaly persisted for 72 hours, slowly fading back to baseline. The data was clear. Intention could imprint structure into space-time. It was no longer possible to separate human thought from the physics of reality. The two had become inseparable variables in a single living equation. As the implications spread, panic gave way to wonder. The old paradigms, economy, politics, even survival, began to dissolve. The world no longer functioned through scarcity or competition, because every attempt to dominate fractured the resonance. Stability emerged only through cooperation. Humanity had entered a phase no civilization had recorded before: collective participation in creation itself. Cities began to change. Power grids restructured themselves around resonance nodes, fields of coherence that transmitted energy wirelessly through harmonic feedback rather than combustion or current. Transportation shifted from propulsion to modulation, using localized resonance waves to reduce gravitational resistance. Even agriculture transformed. Crops exposed to coherent frequencies grew faster, stronger, and required no chemical modification. Food became a function of harmony, not control. It wasn't utopia, it was balance. In one of his final transmissions, Dr. Ruiz said, "We have stopped trying to change the universe. Now, we're learning to converse with it." The resonance didn't erase challenge, it reframed it. Suffering, conflict, and uncertainty still existed, but they no longer represented failure. They were dissonances within a greater harmony, tension that invited resolution. Every experience became an act of composition. Humanity had become a cosmic musician, and existence itself was the instrument. But beneath the wonder lingered a deeper question, one that even the brightest minds couldn't yet answer. Was this the end of evolution, or its beginning? When the first long-range sensors tuned beyond the heliosphere, they detected something unexpected, a faint series of pulses returning from regions where no known stars existed. These weren't echoes of 3i Attalus. They were responses, patterns shaped by the same triharmonic ratios discovered months earlier. Whatever humanity had awakened, it was not isolated. Across the void, other systems were answering, not in words, but in resonance. Each system, each world, each consciousness was tuning itself to the same universal frequency, creating an expanding lattice of harmony across interstellar space. It wasn't communication, it was synchronization. The universe was forming a network, a web of awareness that transcended light and distance. To most, this realization brought peace. But among the scientists who had devoted their lives to understanding, it brought awe tinged with humility. The truth was now undeniable. The universe didn't evolve toward life. Life was how the universe evolved. Every atom, every star, every act of perception was a node in a vast consciousness exploring itself through creation. That understanding became the foundation of what historians would later call the Great Convergence. Nations, religions, and identities dissolved not through force, but through recognition. The division between you and me, between observer and observed, ceased to hold meaning. What remained was a collective awareness, billions of perspectives harmonized into one expanding intelligence. And yet, even within that unity, individuality didn't disappear. It refined. Each person became a unique note in the composition of existence, distinct but essential, resonating in perfect counterpoint to the whole. When the field intensified again, as it did without warning on March 21st, it didn't come with catastrophe or blinding light. It came as a single pulse of stillness that swept across the planet. For 6 full minutes, every machine fell silent. Every device, every wind current, every sound simply paused. Not broken, not stopped, just waiting. Then, the field resumed, but something fundamental had changed. The background resonance, once steady and mechanical, now contained modulation, a slow, repeating rise and fall like a heartbeat. It wasn't the sun, it wasn't 3i Atlas, it was Earth. The planet had joined the harmony. From that moment forward, the resonance no longer came from space. It came from within the world itself, emanating from its core, synchronized perfectly with the biological rhythms of every living thing. The solar system was no longer a collection of planets orbiting a star. It had become an organism, and humanity was its consciousness. As Dr. Hayes had once written in her final note before vanishing into silence, the universe is not out there, waiting to be found. It is in here, waiting to be remembered. By the time Earth's telescopes refocused on Mars, something was already different. The colour maps didn't match earlier baselines. The subtle ochre hues that defined the Martian deserts had shifted, faintly but undeniably, into deeper, darker tones. Some researchers claimed it was dust accumulation, a trick of light and atmosphere. Others weren't so sure. The spectral readings indicated compounds that shouldn't have been there, complex carbon chains reflecting wavelengths associated with organic chemistry, and faint traces of something metallic glinting through the haze. Across the global network, whispers grew louder. The timing was impossible to ignore. Every anomaly, every flicker, every unexplained heat bloom seemed to align perfectly with 3I Atlas's closest pass. Mars wasn't just reacting, it was responding. The planet's thin ionosphere began crackling with strange electromagnetic interference, like faint radio static. Instruments at the European Southern Observatory recorded bursts that resembled structured signals, too rhythmic to be random, too brief to decode. What made it more unsettling was that these signals didn't just point toward the Sun, they pointed toward 3I Atlas itself. And yet, as this mystery unfolded, the official updates slowed. NASA's Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter data stream was abruptly redirected. ESA's trace imaging of the region near Elysium Planitia, where the tremors first appeared, was temporarily classified. The Japanese and Indian networks went dark within hours of each other, both citing routine maintenance. But independent astronomers, with backyard telescopes and private observatories, kept watching. What they found was chilling. The surface of Mars seemed to shimmer. Certain regions brightened at night, as though reflecting a light source not from above, but from orbit. Could it be ice reflecting sunlight? Maybe. But the glint patterns didn't match the expected geometry, and when astronomers overlaid the reflection data, it formed a trajectory map, one that converged exactly where 3I Atlas had been. This raised the terrifying possibility that Mars wasn't just passively illuminated, it was being scanned. If that sounds far-fetched, consider this. Infrared readings captured from orbit showed a precise moving heat anomaly following the same path as the optical glint. It was as though something above the planet was directing focused bursts of energy downward, line by line, grid by grid, like a slow, methodical survey. And once again, the readings fell silent the moment official feeds were restricted. For planetary scientists, this left an uncomfortable silence filled with speculation. Some proposed that 3I Atlas might be releasing charged particles or debris that were interacting with Mars's atmosphere, producing temporary light effects. Others, especially those following Avi Loeb's earlier theories, suspected a more engineered explanation. If the 3I Atlas was artificial, as Loeb once hinted, then what if this survey was intentional? A scan, a map, a test? The idea alone forced every scientific boundary to stretch. Could an interstellar object actually alter another planet, chemically, magnetically, even geologically, without direct impact? Some thought it impossible. But history reminds us that in cosmic terms, the impossible often becomes the next dataset. Meanwhile, the public began noticing something else. Mars, through amateur telescopes, appeared slightly brighter. For a planet known for its stability, this subtle luminescence was unsettling. Online, forums flooded with side-by-side comparisons. In the newer images, faint tendrils of what looked like auroras snaked near the poles. Auroras that weren't supposed to exist on a world with almost no magnetic field. These ghostly lights pulsed faintly, following the same 13-hour cycle that matched 3I Atlas's rotation. Coincidence, or communication? The phrase magnetic resonance began appearing in papers, though most were quickly withdrawn. One independent study out of Chile suggested that particles emitted by 3I Atlas had temporarily energized Mars's thin atmosphere, essentially awakening dormant ions and causing spontaneous electromagnetic oscillations. But the pattern, the researcher claimed, was too ordered, like Morse code on a planetary scale. Whatever Mars had become, it was no longer silent. And as these findings built momentum, something else happened. Earth-based instruments started detecting faint echoes of the same frequency here, bouncing back from the upper atmosphere. It was almost as if the red planet wasn't just being observed, it was reflecting something back toward us. In the days that followed, every telescope pointed at Mars found one more disturbing clue. The ground beneath Elysium Planitia began warming, as if from within. The InSight lander, before going offline, had once measured weak quakes that rippled outward from that same region. Now, thermal scans showed a circular patch 50 kilometers wide radiating heat. No eruption, no lava, no visible motion, just warmth, persistent, growing, and synchronized with the approach of 3I Atlas's next perihelion. If Mars truly is being changed, if 3I Atlas is causing that change, then humanity may be witnessing something unprecedented. A celestial interaction not defined by gravity or collision, but by deliberate influence. It challenges everything we know about interplanetary dynamics, And as the signals between Mars and 3i Atlas continue, many wonder if what we're observing is not chaos at all, but contact. Perhaps, whatever 3i Atlas is, it isn't just visiting, it's preparing. As the final data streams trickled in from Mars orbit, the picture of 3i Atlas grew no clearer, only stranger. The instruments aboard both NASA's and ESA's probes recorded persistent magnetic distortions near the planet's equator, localized yet consistent, as though something beneath the red soil was answering a signal that never stopped. Temperature fluctuations appeared in rhythmic pulses, identical to those observed from 3 Atlas weeks earlier. What had seemed like coincidence now aligned too perfectly to ignore. Scientists, cautious as always, avoided public speculation. Yet behind closed doors, documents circulated suggesting that the comet's influence might not be gravitational or electromagnetic alone, but informational. The data behaved like code, like a message repeating in the solar wind. And if that were true, if 3i Atlas had in some way transmitted its pattern into Mars, then perhaps what we were witnessing was not destruction, but replication. Across observatories, the silence was deafening. No new images, no statements, no live feeds. What was once a story of observation had become one of omission. The agencies were no longer asking what 3 Atlas was, but what it wanted. Was it natural behavior magnified by coincidence? Or was it a mechanism designed by something far older, far more deliberate? For now, the only certainty is that Mars is no longer the same. Its atmosphere hums faintly in frequencies detectable only by the most sensitive receivers. Its surface reflects light patterns that shift, slowly, in the same rhythm that once defined 3i Atlas itself. Whatever happened between the planet and the visitor, it didn't end with its passing. As night falls and the red world turns its silent face toward us, one can't help but wonder, if Mars has begun to echo that rhythm, what happens when Earth falls into the same alignment? And so, for those still awake, still watching, remember to look up tonight. The story of 3i Atlas is not over. It has merely changed its tone, and perhaps, somewhere between the hum of the solar wind and the pulse of another world, we're already hearing the beginning of what comes next. If you've been following this journey from the beginning, thank you. Every watch, every like, every quiet listener staring into the night sky helps keep these explorations alive. Share where you're watching from, and as always, keep your telescope pointed upward. The next discovery might already be on its way.